Okay. So we were talking about the ways in which Hume thinks that the moral causality of national character works. And in order to think about that, it's helpful to think about what he says about the characters of other kinds of people. And this is his discussion of the characters of soldiers, right? Remember this? So the uncertainty of their life makes soldiers lavish and generous, as well as brave. Their idleness together, that most of the time in warfare are just sitting waiting for the next battle. So their idleness, together with the large societies which they form in camps or garrisons, inclines them to pleasure and gallantry. By their frequent change of company, they acquire good breeding and an openness of behavior, and so on. So because these are moral causes, when Hume says that uncertainty makes them generous, he must mean that uncertainty gives them a motive or reason to be generous. When he says that being in large groups inclines them to pleasure and gallantry, he must mean that they have reason as a result of being gathered together in those ways to be engaged in pleasure and be gallant. And when he says that the frequent change of company develops good manners, it must mean that they have reason to develop good manners because they operate in a changing social context. Now, I don't know how plausible you find any of this interesting speculation, but for our purposes, what's crucial is that Hume is supposing the character of soldiers as a profession is the result of their reasoned response to circumstances. It's not because soldiers have a particular kind of body or a particular kind of inherited temperament that they behave in the ways that they do. So there is for Hume nothing about soldiers that accounts, for example, for their becoming soldiers in advance. I mean, one reason why you might think soldiers had a certain character was because a certain kind of person was likely to become a soldier. But remember, he's operating in a time when soldiers were all conscripts. They didn't volunteer. They were voluntold, as they say in the army, to do these things. They didn't have any choice about it. So they were a random sampling of the population. So you couldn't appeal to the special character of that sample to explain their specific kinds of character. Just a quick, brief opportunity to discuss this. Does anybody have a view about how plausible any of this is? I mean, you might think it's not true that soldiers have particular characters. Soldiers are like anybody else, in which case there's nothing to explain. But Hume was under the impression that the soldiers he knew about had these properties. They were brave and gallant and generous, and they had, I think what he means by good breeding is that they had the opportunity to interact with lots of kinds of people, so they got used to interacting with lots of kinds of people. Well, anyway, this is an explanation he offers of the character of a group, and we're turning to discussion of how this sort of explanation might apply to nations, but he's making the general point that one can give explanations of this kind. It doesn't really matter whether this explanation is correct. It's offered as an example of a kind of explanation you might offer. And as such, it seems, whether it's plausible or not, it seems possible that such an explanation might be correct in some ways or other, right? All right, so I'm not going to make you go through that discussion. Now there might seem to be at least a little bit of a tension between what Hume's assuming here and what he said at the start. At the start, he said that men of good sense know that it can be true that a nation of a certain character, even if there are people in that nation, so a nation has a certain character, even if there are particular people in that nation don't have that character. So there can be honest people in a dishonest nation. Remember, I quoted that when I started talking about Hume. So, but if the national character is the result of the operation on individuals in the nation, of the physical and moral causes that operate on every individual in the nation, then why do men of good sense deny that all individuals of the nation are the same? You got people, they're roughly the same. The people of a nation have the same forces operating on them. Why aren't they all the same? Why are there exceptions? Well, there are two obvious, at least two, and I'm going to offer two ways of defending Hume here, of course. One is by pointing to the fact that the moral and physical circumstances of different individuals within the nation are different, right? Some are rich, some are poor, for example. They're in the same nation. Some of them live in the circumstances of poor people. You said something about the character poor people derived from those circumstances. And some of them live in the circumstances of a rich person. So, and Hume would certainly have made that argument, and it's implicit in what he says about professions, that you can't explain the character of a profession in society as being different from everybody else, unless, if you think all the main explanations are moral, you must think that the moral circumstances of the professions are different. Well, then they'll be different from the non-professions in that very same society. And so he has a natural way of generating the possibility of different kinds of people, even within a society, even though he's talking about national character in general. The second possible line of defense is that the people of a single nation may differ among themselves in ways that mean that a particular moral or physical cause has a different impact on different people. Because the effect of a cause on someone depends not only on the nature of the cause, but also on the nature of the person. All right? So if you make a loud bang in here, I'm going to react with shock. But maybe there's some relaxed people in here who don't do that. Same cause, different effect. Why? Difference in the person. Now, Hume doesn't generally suggest this line of thought. He's considering a theory of national character. So he's interested in the things that tend to be true of the people as a whole, even if they're not true of every one of them. And so he's not interested here in exploring individual differences. That's not the topic. If he was interested in individual differences, the discussion would be shaped differently. Now, Hume goes on to make 9 arguments against the significance of physical causes, what he calls climate. And I'm not going to go through them all. You read them. They're on this slide. If you didn't read them, you can, when I make this slide available, you can look them all on the slide. And then after this, all this stuff, there's a long skeptical discussion of evidence that how much sunlight you're exposed to determines the character of a nation. So he's skeptical that the fact that the Scandinavians get less sun than the Tunisians is going to be an explanation of differences between the character of the Norwegians and the Tunisians. He does consider a couple of possible counterexamples to his claim that climate matters. So he's skeptical about the general idea that climate matters, but he does consider, you remember there was a counterexample he considers, right? And that has to do with alcoholism and sexuality. So, as it were, fraternity matters. The only observation with regard to the difference of men in different climates on which we can rest any weight, he says, is the vulgar one, the one that is commonly known, that people in the northern regions have a greater inclination to strong liquors, and those in the southern to love and women. These people must be men, probably. One can assign a very probable physical cause for this difference. So generally, differences in character are moral, but I'm going to give you a counterexample. Where wine and distilled waters warm the frozen blood in the colder climates and fortify men against the injuries of the weather. As the genial heat of the sun in the countries exposed to his beams, inflames the blood and exalts the passions between the sexes. So this is one example of a difference in character that he thinks is caused by physical conditions. But he then goes on to point out that he says this is the vulgar view, this is the common view, this is the view that most people have. Vulgus is just the Latin for the crowd. It's what the crowd thinks. But he thinks these might have moral causes as well. And so he's not sure that these physical ones are correct. In hot climates, for example, people tend to wear fewer clothes, and that might be associated with greater sexual temptation. And in cold climates, he thinks alcohol is harder to come by. So if these are to be moral causes, it must be that seeing people naked gives you more reason to engage in sex, and having less alcohol available must give you a reason to desire it. And since Hume is making these explanations, he must be assuming that these claims are plausible. And then, in any case, he suggests that these claims are not obviously even true. He considers amorous Muscovites, people of Moscow in the north, and those drunken Greeks, remember, the Greeks are susceptible to the bottle. So maybe there isn't such a pattern to explain at all. So he sort of sets himself off to suggest that he might be open to the possibility of physical causes of differences in national character, but then when he actually comes down to giving one, he sort of expresses skepticism about it, dismantles it. So he's back with his general claim that most of the differences in character are moral, which is the central thesis of this essay. Now, Hume's discussion is aimed at refuting a view that was widespread in his day. This essay was probably written in 1748, in the year that Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu, who was a very distinguished French intellectual who wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws. And in that book, many things happen. That this is where this is one of the sources of the idea that it's important to have a separation of powers between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government, for example. So that's one of his ideas. And that idea was so radical that this book was anonymous when it came out. But he also develops this climatic theory of character, national character. And Montesquieu's ideas were in circulation before they were actually published. Remember, Hume was in touch with French intellectual life. He studied at La Flèche. He was the secretary of the British ambassador in Paris, Rousseau, so he's in these conversations. And so he would have been aware of them. And anyway, he wouldn't have had to know about any of that because, as we saw, he certainly knew, well, I can tell you, he certainly knew about Herodotus, and Herodotus has these climatic theories of national character, as we saw earlier. All right, so we have enough in place now of Hume's general account to focus in on a passage in the essay that's of very great importance for our purposes, which is a footnote that he added to the essay in 1753. It's the one that I said, I gave an example when we started out of being disappointed by a philosopher. This is where Hume expresses the view that disappoints me. The passage in red was added later in another edition. So the final version is like this. He says, I'm apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 of them, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion. In this case, complexion presumably means skin color, not, as I said, it might mean character. nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation, no ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts, no sciences. On the other hand, the most rude and barbarous of the whites, such as the ancient Germans or the present Tatars, have still something eminent about them in their valor, form of government, or some other particular. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction between these breeds of men. Now, again, this may seem, as it were, innocent language to you, but Hume is writing at a time when the vast majority of European intellectuals remain convinced of the biblical view of the human creation. So it wasn't nature, but God that marked the differences. And since God, and between the animals, but since God only created humans once, Adam and Eve, God didn't create an original distinction between the breeds of men. So when he says that nature does, he's offering a theory that comes out of new non-theological ways of thinking about the origins of what later on is going to be called the origins of species, the origins of different kinds of human beings. Okay, not to mention, an interesting feature of the English language that if you begin a sentence by saying not to mention, we're about to mention something. Not to mention our colonies, there are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of whom none ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity. Though no people without education will start up among us and distinguish themselves in every profession. In Jamaica, indeed, they talk about one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but it is likely he's a man for slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. Now, the main effect of the change, this adding in this red stuff, is to focus on the alleged inferiority of black people away from the alleged superiority of white people. So it's now putting black people at the bottom of the hierarchy because he's mentioned the other kinds of people. Before, he just said talking about black people. And as I said, he's clearly using complexion to mean skin color here. He doesn't use the word race in this essay to refer to human beings, though he does mention races of animals at one point, but that just means kinds of animals in the English of the period. But he does suppose that there are distinct species of human beings in the original version of the footnote, and this essay was written more than a decade after the appearance in Latin of Linnaeus's Systema Naturae, which introduced the modern system of classification of animals by genus and species, Homo sapiens. Drosophila melanogaster, I mentioned, the black-bellied Drosophilus and so on. And in that book, Linnaeus turns these Latin words, genus and species, into technical scientific words. So from now on, in the technical literature, species means a Linnaean species, as opposed to just a general kind of thing, right? So you could say, in 18th century English, you could say, there's a species of lawyer that lives in dark places, right? That would be a perfectly ordinary thing to say. In scientific context, species is that. And genus is just another Latin word for a kind. And again, it's coming to have this technical notion that we now have when we classify animals and plants by species and genus. Those are just two Latin words which meant the same thing in Latin, but they come to be technical scientific terms. And Linnaeus is the Swedish botanist who invented all this. I mean, obviously, like all scientists, he's in conversation with other people, but it's his Systema Naturae where this is also out. And that's where, for the first time, humans get to be called Homo sapiens. So what in the passage, in this passage, he's not using the word species in this technical sense. He just means a kind across the five kinds of people. Though his use of this word does suggest that he has some kind of scientific classification in mind. Note too, that while he talks about Negroes as a humankind, he doesn't say they're a nation. This is an essay on national character. Why are we talking about Negroes at all? They're not a nation. But in context, it's clear that he thinks that he's discussing about Black people the same sort of question that he asked about Greeks or Turks or Swiss people. Now, as we've seen, when Hume makes claims about the character of such a given group, he considers it possible that there can be counterexamples to it. This is the view of men of sense with which he began. Nevertheless, here he's inclined to insist to reject the view of men of sense and to suggest that there's never been a single Black person of distinction, that this claim is not generally true, but universally true. And so he aims here to refute the one counterexample that he refers to, which is of a Jamaican Negro. Now, as it happens, he doesn't name him, but we know who he was talking about. He was talking about Francis Williams, a free Black Jamaican who was a British citizen, actually got British citizenship, so he was a citizen of Britain. And he studied at Cambridge University, my alma mater. And he showed his learning in many ways. Among them, he wrote a learned poem in Latin as a tribute to the new governor of Jamaica, George Haldane. This is an English version. I couldn't find quickly the Latin version of this ode addressing the new governor of the place where he was born and where he lived after he came back from university. Hume's disinclination to believe that Francis Williams is more than a parrot. This is kind of odd thing for a parrot to do, to write a couple of pages of poetry in Latin about something. And then that's ironical, at least ironical when he focused on Francis Williams, because Hume missed the better example that I introduced you in the first lecture of Anton Wilhelm Amu, who had already received a doctoral degree in philosophy, Hume's subject, at the time, at a famous university that Hume knew perfectly well about, by the time this essay was written. As the picture of William shows, it was probably commissioned by him. This is not a detailed enough print, but if you look at the original, he was certainly capable of reading difficult academic texts. He wrote in Latin as a learned person as well as in English. There were, and in fact, this here indicates an interest in, I think this is an astronomical thing, not a terrestrial globe. So I think it's an interest in astronomy. And this book's in Latin, but you can't see that from this rather dotted picture. And anyway, there are other examples that Hume could certainly have known about. So, for example, in the preface to Cervantes's Don Quixote, Don Quixote de la Mancha, which was published in two parts in 1605 and 1615, in the preface, Cervantes refers to El Negro Juan Latino. That's the Spanish for the black man, Juan Latino. And Juan Latino was a dark-skinned color who was famous in Spain in the 16th century for his great learning. In fact, his great learning in Latin. That's why he was called Latino, because he was a professor of Latin. Now, I've actually cheated here. I should say this is not Juan Latino. I don't think there is a picture of Juan Latino. This is another person of about the same time living in Spain and painted by Velázquez. And since you happen to have the privilege of living in New York City, you can go and see this painting in the Metropolitan Museum. Now, Cervantes, as I say, mentions Juan Latino in passing in these words in the preface, which are addressed to sorry, lost my place. Which are addressed to the author, to himself. He's addressing himself. And he's saying, this is how he refers to him, Black Latino's gift of tongues. And I just go back and, yeah. What he says is, this is a translation, obviously. Since heaven it hath not pleased on thee, Cervantes, deep erudition to bestow, or Black Latino's gift of tongues, no Latin let thy pages show. So the reason Cervantes gives for writing a novel in Spanish, as opposed to Latin, which is the language of scholarly people, is because he doesn't know it. And he's contrasting himself here with Juan Latino, who did know it and was famously knowledgeable about Latin. So Juan Latino was a byword for scholarly knowledge of Latin, and Hume can hardly be doubted to have had access to Don Quixote. Why? Because he mentions Cervantes in this very passage. And that's the only book of Cervantes anybody would have read in England, and so on. So I'm inclined to say that Hume's footnote displays prejudice against black people, that he skews the evidence, ignores evidence that he either was or should have been aware of. He didn't look into the matter if he really didn't notice the reference to Juan Latino in his edition of Cervantes, and if he really didn't know about Amu, and if he really had looked into Francis Williams, he wouldn't have said what he said. So this, it seems to me, this footnote displays a kind of prejudice, intellectual prejudice against black people. And it runs against, as I said, his general account, which tends to be that, of course, in a dishonest nation, there'll be honest people, and therefore in a stupid nation, there'll be some clever people. He's trying to rule that out completely in this footnote, and that's weird, given his general disposition, and it's hard to see it as other than a kind of racial prejudice. Remember, Hume's discussion of the other differences of character among nations assumes that the people of those nations have fundamentally the same underlying natures. While Hume does not have the racial concepts of the 19th century, which as I said, come increasingly to focus on biology and the body, he does seem to think that there's a deep difference between the natures of black and white people, a difference so deep that black people cannot achieve anything in the arts and learn. So in stating that there is an original distinction between these breeds of men, he's pushing towards the idea of racial difference that is inherited. That's what you're talking about breeds, you're talking about inheritance, right? That's the language of breeding animals in agriculture. And so he has acquired one of the elements of the sort of racial attitude that was to become predominant later. In this context, and given what he knew or should have known, this is obviously an intellectual failure on Hume's part, and some of his contemporaries pointed this out. It's particularly ironic when you read the sentence to which this footnote is appended. This, however, is certain that almost all the general observations which have been formed of the more southern or more northern people in these planets are found to be uncertain and fallacious. So it's plausible, I think, to say that his feelings, the feelings that were driving him, involved a kind of color-based animus against black people that was becoming increasingly common among European intellectuals at this time, but was not there a little bit earlier in the response to Anton Wilhelm Amu. It's a new thing coming along. And despite the fact that the first claim is modestly stated, he says, I am apt to suspect, I am inclined to suspect, the tone does not continue in the later passage, and he concludes very skeptically, such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction between these breeds of men. And this degree of confidence in a man who was most famous in his day for skepticism tempts me to say of him what he said of others. Where men, this is Hume in Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, where men are the most sure and arrogant, they are commonly the most mistaken, and have there given reins to passion without that proper deliberation and suspense, which can alone secure them from the grossest absurdities. So we'll be turning next to a discussion of what happens when national difference comes to be caught increasingly in racial terms. And when that happens, we'll see that Hume's distinction between moral physical causes has disappeared, and a new way of thinking about human difference has come into being. But before I turn to that, let me ask you to think with me about this question. What moral causes, in Hume's sense, not ours, could Hume have given for the fact that there were few black intellectuals in Europe in his day? He thinks there are enough, but so there's none, there's nothing. Well, remember, a moral cause has to be what? It has to be something that gives you a reason to do something that's motivated. And yes,
access to education gives you reason to.
right. Good. I mean, if, as in the Americas, for example, it's illegal to give a black person a book, you'd have to be more than averagely highly motivated to start studying. The main reason people got for pursuing intellectual life was an education. But black people weren't being educated, except when they were, like Amu, ended up as professors and philosophers. Some exaggeration with that, but it seems to me that Hume, if Hume had thought about it for a minute, he might have thought he might have said what the Abbé Grégoire, who wrote the book called De la littérature des nègres in the French Revolution, on the literature of black people, said to Thomas Jefferson. And he said to Thomas Jefferson, you say in the notes on the state of Virginia, black people can't do these things. Has it occurred to you that no one's ever given the opportunity to try? And then he told him about his book, and he said, by the way, I've written a book in which I've assembled a great list of black people who did just the thing you say black people can't do in your book. Notes on the state of Virginia. So it wasn't that nobody could have said this. People did actually say it. And it's depressing that someone who was otherwise so interesting got this so badly wrong. All right. I'm moving on from Hume now, so if you have any Humean thoughts, you should probably express them right now. So feel free to come back to anything you like at any time, of course. Yes?
Was one of Hume's moral causes rooted in the pseudoscientific idea of needing towards intellectual thought? Like, could it have also been just kind of temporary ideas of the black race and being like, oh, these types of people have a hard time grasping what's.
Yes, I mean, he clearly thinks that. But that's, I would say, those sorts of thoughts don't yet, they're casual observations. They're not yet, they don't yet belong to the body of scientific study of human capacity, which doesn't really come for another 100 years. The rise and so methods psychology.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Okay. All right. So, understand. Oh, I need to. Sorry, move into a different. Pivot 6. Where are we? This is 5th and 6th, I guess. Thank you. Make sure I know where I am. Let's see. Let's start this. How do I do that? Slide share. All right. So understanding the idea of race involves grasping how people think about races and what they take to be the central truths about races, and under what circumstances they will apply the idea of race, and what consequences thoughts about race will have for their actions, or flow from applying, or what flows from applying a racial label to something. So that's one way of thinking about racial concepts, and I call that the ideational view of racial concepts. At the ideational account. Why is this not? Oh, sorry, I need to share the right thing. Sorry. So that's what I was calling the ideation. That's if you're trying to understand a concept, one thing you can do is to try to figure out how it works in the minds of the people about it, how they apply it, what it leads them to do, and so on, and what the central claims they think are true about it. Another different way of thinking about this is to develop what I call a referential view, and that's a matter of saying what the word race means by identifying the things that would define. What are the races? Now these views, so we just identify them. Now these views are not as far apart as they might at first appear. To find out what people are referring to when they use the word race, after all, you need to have some idea of what idea their word race expresses. If they had no ideas, if they had no thoughts about race, they never used the word, if it had no consequences in their behavior when they applied it, then we could hardly suppose that when they made the sound race, they were talking about anything at all. So in practice, at least, access to an idea of race is probably needed to find the referent. And conversely, once you've identified the referent, found the races, we can assume that people who understand the word race have some beliefs that are at least roughly true of the races. Because if people are talking about races, it's because they have, or they think they have, met some, experienced some races, and generally speaking, some of their experience will no doubt be reliable. A little bit of knowledge of what races are like, combined with a little information about what people are like, how their eyes and ears work, will allow us to predict some of people's ideas about races when they're exposed to them. And I think that anyone concerned to understand a concept of race, our concept of race, ought to be interested both in the reality of race, where are the races, the things that the referential account will give you, and in the way people think about it, the ideational stuff. We can leave it for the philosophers of language to figure out which of these ought to have a central place in the philosophical theory of meaning, or whether we need them both. But I'm just, I think that if you were trying to explain to someone who had not had the experience of race talk, because I always lived in Iceland and never been anywhere and never talked to anybody about outside Iceland and so on. You would want to do both these things. You would want to explain the idea and you would want to point us, give some references. So I use these ideas in the reading to provide a structure for fitting together what we know about the concept of race. So let's look in more detail now at these two lines of thought and review what they tell us about the concept of race, if I'm roughly right. I should say I'll say this from time to time, you're going to be reading stuff by me. The fact that you are reading a paper by me doesn't mean that this person agrees with it. I wrote this a while ago, maybe I changed my mind. Didn't assume that just because I'm explaining the views of this past guy, they're my views. They were my views, or at least I presented them as my views, but I don't necessarily. So you shouldn't feel free to disagree with them. I may well disagree with them myself. So first, on the simplest ideational account, which I'll call the criterial account, to understand the concept like race, we need to know the rules for applying the word to things in the world. The rules, and those rules are given by a set of criterial beliefs about those things. So those beliefs fix the content of the concept, and everyone who understands the word has to have those criterial beliefs, has to know how to apply the word race in some cases. There are criteria for applying the word race because every one of these beliefs is true of races by definition. It's not quite the same thing as saying that the criterial beliefs must state necessary and sufficient conditions for being a race, as we'll see in a while, but let's start with that idea. The idea is we're looking for necessary and sufficient conditions. So to state necessary and sufficient conditions for something being an F, you need to identify some properties, P1 through Pn, that are properties necessary for being an F. That means you can't be an F unless you have these properties, right? So one property necessary for being a human being is being a mammal. So as a result, it's true of everything that if it's a human being, it's a mammal. So a natural way of putting this is all humans are mammals, all Fs are humans. Notice that these statements are all universal generalizations. So they'd be put in English by saying all Fs are P1, all Fs are P2, all Fs are P3. And one account of necessary conditions for being a human being was common in medieval scholasticism. It was every human being is an animal, every human being is rational. So every human being is an animal, every human being is rational. So it's necessary for being a human to be an animal, and it's necessary for being a human to be rational. These people believed in angels, so they thought there were rational things that weren't human beings. They didn't think that the humans were the only animals. But they did think that, now, there are lots of uninteresting necessary conditions for being a human being, right? You cannot be a human being if you are not larger than an ant. So being larger than an ant is a property that every human being must have. But you wouldn't want to mention that. Interesting. And one way of looking for which necessary properties something has that are interesting is if you can find a small set of interesting properties such that if something has all the necessary properties, then it has to be a thing of that kind. So if the necessary conditions are together sufficient, right? If having P1 through Pn guarantees that you're an F, then we've got necessary conditions, interesting necessary conditions for being an F, and we've got sufficient conditions. So now we can say what an F is, because every F is going to have all the necessary conditions, and anything that has all the necessary conditions will be an F. Okay. Now, Plato, maybe not entirely seriously, defined human beings as featherless bipeds. So he thought that the only two-footed animals that had no feathers were humans. So he thought it was necessary to be featherless and bipedal to be human, and that the two were jointly sufficient. Yes.
Are monkeys also, bipedal and feathers?
Yes. So Plato was wrong. But there's it was pointed out pretty early on, it was pointed out by Diogenes the Cynic in the 5th century BCE that this was wrong, not because of monkeys, but because you can pluck a chicken. So that's a featherless biped. I don't recommend doing that to a chicken. You would be rightly prosecuted under our animal cruelty laws if you did that. And I don't know how that was produced, but the picture. But so Plato was wrong about this. But Plato was aiming at what Aristotle called real definition. He wasn't trying to explain what the word human means. So he didn't think that everyone who knew the word human, the Greek word for human, believed that humans were featherless bipeds and knew that they weren't featherless bipeds. He just thought that, as a matter of fact, that the only featherless bipeds were humans. Now he was wrong. And clearly, since he was a competent speaker of Greek, that wasn't something that every competent Greek speaker believed, because there were a few Greeks, including Diogenes the Cynic, who knew about featherless chickens. Now, when people are trying to understand a concept ideationally, they're not looking for a real definition of this sort, kind that Plato was looking for. They're looking, as I said, for the beliefs that are not just true, but must be known by every competent speaker to be true. Because the meaning is supposed to be what everybody who knows the language knows. And a sentence that expresses a belief that you have to have in order to count as knowing what a word means is what philosophers call an analytic truth. It's true, as we say, in virtue of the meaning of the word. Anybody who knows the meaning of the word has to, and the words in the sentence has to know that it's true. You don't have to go looking. Now, this word analytic was introduced into philosophy by Immanuel Kant. And he...
Yeah, how do you determine a criteria or a belief that all people know to be true without making an assumption?
Well, I think you're just supposed to ask it.
But how do you ask everything?
Well, so you could. I mean, with a big enough crowd. From the National Science Foundation, so that'd be one way to do it. But in fact, of course, when we use the word, we're assuming that the person we're talking to knows our language, and that therefore they know the things about that word that we know in order to be able to use the language. So if I think that in order to know what the word bachelor means, you have to know that somebody who's male or unmarried is bachelor. Then if you deny it, I'm just going to deny that you know what the word bachelor means.
But in the case of like a bachelor, for example, maybe let's say that I don't agree that a bachelor has to be a male. It could be somebody that identifies as any gender. Would the case of a bachelor being a male still be this like criteria that everybody needs to know over time?
Good. There are going to be in actual language, there are going to be dialects, and there are going to be idiolects and different ways of speaking. And therefore there are going to be cases where what's the right way according to the rules of one person speaking to one language to another. And when those things arise, speakers who disagree can resolve that in a variety of ways. They can say, okay, I'm happy to use the word bachelor because I'm married with myself. Or they can say, don't be ridiculous, we have a perfectly good English word for that, it's Smith stuff. Right? And then you have to negotiate, because language, in the end, is about settling conventions, and that means that if people don't agree on something, the language isn't going to work. So at some point, you've got to get some kind of agreement. but these are good questions about how one would actually go about doing them. But this word analytic was introduced by Kant, and he defined it in terms of only one kind of sentence, namely what he called the subject. This is this is a subject predicate sentence. It's a sentence that says of some S that it has the following P. And he said that he gave his definition was that the idea of the predicate, the idea of being an unmarried male, is already contained in the idea of bachelor. Right? That's the way he put it. Now, since there are lots of sentences that are true in virtue of meaning that aren't subject predicate form, we have to generalize this somehow. And but this is the basic idea. I'm not going to spend time trying to generalize it. The general idea then is just truth in virtue of meaning. So on the criterial view, we're looking for necessary and sufficient conditions that are analytic, that every speaker of the language must know, proper competent speaker of the language must know, right? How would this go in the case of race? Well, remember, as we've seen, ancestral is one of the claims that we thought was analytically true. That is, everybody who understands what races are knows that if your parents are of the same race, you're of the same race as your parents. Right? Now, as I pointed out, that isn't true of raça in Brazilian Portuguese, and so that suggests that that word doesn't translate our word race, if this is analytically true for our word race. But anyway, we're going to go looking for truths like this, analytic truths that we think are analytic, and assemble them so that we've got a bunch of necessary conditions which are jointly sufficient, and the claims are all analytically true, right? All right. There's another reason. And I should say, having introduced you to this idea, that starting in the 1950s, there was a significant debate in the philosophy of language in the English-speaking world, one side of which were people who said there weren't any analytic proofs. And Willard von Orman Quine, a Harvard logician and philosopher, is associated with the doctrine that there aren't any analytic proofs. So, and I'm not going to weigh in on that question. But this is an approach that found favor with people who thought there were analytic proofs. But look, there's another reason to think that analytically necessary and sufficient conditions may not be available in the way that I said they might be on the simple criterial theory. This is the simple, looks complicated, but it's actually quite simple. This is the simple theory. And that's because many of the things that people know about, or think they know about race, because they know how the word works, are not universal generalizations at all. They're things like, they're generics of the sort that I mentioned before. They're things like Negroes have the same skin color. And this isn't equivalent to the universal generalization for all X and Y. If X and Y are both R, then X has the same skin color as Y. That's a way of saying in logician's language, any all R's have the same skin color. It isn't equivalent to that universal generalization, because this is refuted by a single counterexample. Right? You only have to have one counterexample and it's refuted. But the generic is not refuted by a counterexample. How many people think that tigers eat people? Really? Nobody? I wouldn't let you loose in India. So you think tigers don't eat people? What do you think about tigers and eating people? Yes, so, but I didn't say that tigers have a diet of people, I just said they eat other things as well. They eat mice, rats, and people.
I believe if iron were in here, it might like kind of bite on somebody, but I don't think it would continue to eat the person.
Okay,
Like you can see.
okay, that's one kind of thing, but suppose it would. I'm telling you that if you give people bodies, tigers, they will in fact. There's a famous tiger in last I mean you know, try to say you're like 300. That's not good. She was a yes.
I think time.
Yes, good. Would eat some, but I didn't say that. I said a hungry tiger probably would eat someone if that was all there was. Yes, but that's what I said. I said tigers eat people.
Are you generalizing with all tigers or just like tigers? Like just the existence of tigers?
No, I'm distinguishing between the generic and the universal rule. I'm saying I agree that not all tigers eat people. Most tigers don't have the opportunity to eat people because people keep away from tigers. But they're the strengths tiger a lot of people. But I didn't say all tigers. That's obviously false. That's refuted by one non-human eating tiger, and the Bronx Zoo is one of those. But that's neither here nor there for the purposes of deciding whether tigers eat.
Would you not in that case go to claim that any substantial therefore a tiger can eat one person at any time?
So you're suggesting that tigers eat people is equivalent to at least one tiger has eaten a person.
Yeah.
But I didn't say. I said tigers eat people. I agree that at least one tiger. I think it's absolutely clear that at least one tiger has eaten a person. This one will be 300. But it's not clear to me that from the fact that I can find you one tiger that's in all of these terms. Often I can find you a human being that's the person. But if you don't say humans,
You say tiger will be people and say you find the further one on the path is that you know at least one person. Is that not a substantiation?
so 3 cannibals proves that humans eat people.
What humans do? Not very hungry.
Ah.
Not very good.
Good. So you think the generic humans eat people is true?
Yeah.
Because
Something with
Because-
something.
okay, good. So if that's right, what about humans did a high jump? It's a sport of the Olympics, or what is called? What is that called? In your twins? High jump. Yeah, sorry. What is that called? Okay, good. Pole vault. I mean, that's different, but that's close, if that's what you recognize. Pole vaults will do. Do humans pole vault? Okay. Do humans write books called One Genetic? Just one person who will look over Wall Street. Yes. Okay. So Americans are stupid, but also Americans are intelligent. Americans are gay, and Americans are straight. Americans are tall, and Americans are short. These are all things that you guys will be willing to say. And so is there any generic about Americans that you wouldn't say? That's true of just one American? Well, I leave that as an exercise for you to think about. But the way people normally construe generics are, do mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus? I didn't say can mosquitoes carry the West Nile. I said, do they carry it? I mean, you may not know what it is now, but it's common. It says in the medical textbooks that mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus, right? And that we say that even though most mosquitoes don't carry them. Only very few, so probably under 1%. Now you may, but that's okay because you're committed to the view that if even one mosquito carries the West Nile virus, mosquitoes carry the West Nile.
Yeah, so this logic is really justify stereotypes and stereotypes.
Well, I think, I don't think that Americans are either better or stupid. So I'm not up for this. But you're the guys who are keen on generics, so you're the ones who are happy accepting stereotyping generics. But we'll get back to this, but yes, generics, as I said before, are very important in the structure of stereotypes. All right. But the point is that the sorts of things I think that most people would say when you ask them the truth about race are going to be generic. They're not going to be universal claims, like every black person or every white person. They're going to be things like black people have black skin, white people have white skin. And these are not the same as most black people have black skin. I don't know whether that's true. It depends on how you define black. And it depends on how you define black people. And as I pointed out to you, many people of African descent in this country are white today. So, in fact, probably more than are black. At least if that study in the 1950s was correct. So, one reason why you can't do the strict criterial count is just going to be that that what people believe about races is not best characterized in terms of universal generalizations at all. It's characterized in terms of generics. You and I don't agree about how to use generics, but everybody agrees that the generic claim that black people have black skin, for example, is not equivalent to every black person has black skin, and it's not equivalent to, well, you think that's true even with only one black person has a black skin. I don't. If our thinking about these things is shaped by generics, then that's another reason for being skepticism about trying to create a view that's characterized in terms of universal generalizations. And as we saw with Walter White, it's certainly not true that all African Americans have black skin. White was black American, not have black skin. Maybe most do, but that's not what most people say when you ask them about these things. They don't say most black people have black skin, they just say black people have black skin. They utter the generic. All right. So the proposal in the paper was identify the claims that most people who know them with race will agree to. and identify the races as the things of which those claims are true. Right? So one question I have for you is, so what's that involve? That involves collecting what you might call racial common sense, right? And then using it to identify what most people believe races are, therefore what what the word race means. Presumably what the word race means is what most people mean. So one question I have for you now is, do you think we can eventually come up with a set of claims that are widely believed by most English speakers who use the word race correctly, racial common sense? If so, why? And if not, why not? These are, so, okay. What odds would you take a bet on a bet that you could do? Yes.
I think you could, because on the terms of what we were talking before about the generalization, say a statement, it might not apply to everyone, it can give somewhat of maybe a definition of what race could be. Even though maybe for some reasons, with the example of like your great nephew, for example, like you can define what something would be, even though it's not applied to everyone.
Right. Good. So, I'm inclined to think that most people are as we would have said, I'm apt to suspect that most Americans could do a bit of this. If you said to them, I'm from Iceland, what do you guys mean by race? I know all the other words in English, so use any English words you like. I'm inclined to think that many Americans would think they could take up a task and that they would do it by saying the things that they think are true about races. But apparently, well, I don't know whether the silence of the others is because they don't think that or because they're shy. But does anybody else think the opposite? Does anybody say, no, we couldn't possibly? Yes.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible, and I think it would become increasingly more difficult as the years go on. Specifically because of the amount of mixed race people that are currently being born, more and more we're moving towards this kind of like homogenous society. Our skin tones are evening out, and a lot of people predict that in the coming decades, the new generation will have less variety of skin tones, for example. So while I think maybe this could have been done a couple generations ago, I think because of the intermixing of criteria like ancestry or skin color happening right now, it's no longer possible to give a distinct set of criteria that everything.
So, but that's interesting because we don't normally think that changes in the world affect changes in the meaning of words. You're suggesting that in this case, it would.
Absolutely. I think it's true with other words, like technology, for example. 40 years ago, artificial intelligence would have been included in the definition of technology because artificial intelligence wasn't known by the masses. So I absolutely do think that changes in global context and global events can change the definition of word or muddle that definition.
But if we looked up the word technology in the Oxford Dictionary in 1970, I bet you that there would be one definition under which AI would be. So we don't have to change the meaning of the word technology to add AI. to technology.
Well, I think we would have to. I don't think there's any definition in technology that assigns technology as a rational thinker. Whereas nowadays, AI is very capable of rational thought and has frankly changed our whole idea of what it means to have rational thought. Just a few years ago, philosophers believed that the only beings on this earth that were capable of rational thinking were the human race. And that's no longer true. So I think with that notion, the idea and definition of technology would completely have to change to fit artificial intelligence. And the same could be true with the idea of race.
Okay.
So after that, sort of the adaptability of the human language as a whole, continues as the changing ideas about the things that we find as well. As just
Sure.
as Julian just said, sort of regarding artificial intelligence, so definition of technology, Anthropic standards, and there's some introduced in the 18th, 1700s to think through things of scientific nature. Even with the idea of race, it's been so framed around a definition rooted in an issue. This is a racial issue regarding this, it's an issue regarding why. Even today, it means something that even 30, 40 years ago, means to follow just like all race and language. And I feel like this is more of a semantic issue with linguistics than it's an issue by the definition, because we rarely agree on anything as a human being.
We ready what? I didn't hear.
We rarely agree on almost anything. There are things that we sort of digress and say, okay, this means this, so it must mean it for us to understand what exactly we're arguing about. But race being as broad a subject as we have a class in regards to the philosophical implications of it, I feel like that's an issue that's interpretation. That's going to usually be brought to one.
So, you said this was, as it were, a matter of semantics, but it is a matter of semantics. It's semantics is the study of what things mean. And surely, so don't you think that there are claims that the person could make about race that you have to reject? You have to reject their claim to know what they were talking about. We said the Trumps are a race. Most people say, well, that's not what we mean by it. So there's some constraints on how to talk about these things set like this general reading, even if they aren't sufficient. That's necessary for condition. There is some semantic constraints on how we use words, otherwise if they wouldn't be able to read them.
Well, if you look at the word, what the word race has done, it's very much tied to like power structure. So, because race has like a social function, word, hierarchy, identity, it's consensus is blocked by its social function. Right.
Well, that's an interesting thought, but you'll agree that it doesn't follow from the fact that something has a social function that consensus on it is not possible. So it must be something special about the racial category that makes it resistant to consensus. Yeah. Okay, I mean, that may be true, but that is, we might think it's a special feature of the word race, that because of the kind of role it plays in our social life, there are reasons for people to disagree about how to use it. That would be one thought we might have. All right, we'll go on. But I want to proceed along the lines suggested by the view here that there's a possibility of doing this, and then we'll see where we get to.
Sound recording?
Where do I look for that?
if there, if there is no like red line, it means probably done recording, yeah.
Just end the meeting.
Yeah.